What would have to happen to your mind in a survival situation for you to do the most unthinkable thing? And I'm talking like a famine for an extended period of time where there's no food and you have absolutely no idea when help is going to come. What would have to happen for something that would normally be considered an unthinkable thing to then become an option? I think most of us would say like, oh, we would try to barter, or we would just try to survive for as long as we can. But what if it came down to you or your loved one? Well, unfortunately for this mother, it came down to either her or her son. And she chose her son. And as disturbing as this story is, I want to look at the circumstances surrounding this woman. As a matter of fact, there were two women specifically in the story who offered up their sons during this survival situation. And I want to examine just what exactly extreme deprivation can do to the human mind. And that's what we're going to dive into today. We're going to look into this story of how two starving mothers made an unthinkable deal. A deal that would ultimately cost one of their sons' life. And we're going to look into what this story might reveal about our own behaviors and our own character, our own security or well-being when it becomes threatened. Hi everyone, and welcome back to Mind and Bible, where we let God transform us by changing the way we think. Okay, so our story takes place in 2 Kings 6, during a time when Samaria was under siege by King Ben-Hadad, the king of Aram. And so a siege was essentially a way of defeating a city by surrounding it and cutting it off. And the city was cut off from the resources that it needed to survive. So instead of breaking through the walls, an opposing army could surround the city and make it increasingly difficult for food, for supplies, and for people to move in and move out, which meant the longer the siege continued, the more desperate the conditions within the city would become. And so the famine in Samaria became severe. 2 Kings tells us that the donkey's head was being sold for 80 shekels of silver. To give you a little background, a donkey's head was considered unclean during that time. So that's something that people usually stayed away from. This was under the Mosaic law. So it was something that was forbidden as food. Yet people became so desperate that even an unclean, forbidden food became so expensive, which I think I Googled it. 80 shekels was considered about 2,000 USD. So when we meet these two mothers, we're not obviously meeting them under normal circumstances. They are living in a city that is starving to death. So one day, the king of Israel is walking along the city wall when a woman cries out for help. Eventually, the king asks her what is wrong. And that's when she tells him the story. She says that another woman had come to her with a deal, and they both agreed, give your son today and we'll eat him. Tomorrow we'll eat my son. And they boiled her son and ate him. And when the next day came and it was time for the other woman to give up her son, she hid. Okay, so here's the thing about the story that kind of makes it the most disturbing to me, at least, is that when she went to the king, she didn't say, I just ate my son. I feel horrible about what happened. She was just like, the other woman did not hold up on her deal. Isn't there some kind of punishment for that? And that's how severe the famine was at the time. And just how much she was not hungry, but starving. And when the king hears this, he tears his clothes and he has on sackcloth, and he's just grieving over how severe his city has become and how bad the famine has become. So now we have to ask the question, what causes someone, specifically a mother, to do something like this? So if this was a modern case, we would probably start digging through this woman's past, right? So what caused her? Was there a history of violence? Did she have some sort of mental illness? Was she abusive towards her kids? What was her childhood like? Was there any warning signs leading up to this? Well, unfortunately, because this story was written about over 2,000 years ago, the Bible doesn't give us any of that information, so we don't have much to go on. But Scripture does give us this one critical detail. She was starving with absolutely no end in sight on when she's going to receive food. So maybe the better question is, what can this level of deprivation do to an ordinary human mind? In 1944, researchers at the University of Minnesota conducted what became known as the Minnesota Starvation Experiment. 36 young men were placed on a semi-starvation diet for 6 months. And these weren't men who were selected because they had done on some kind of criminal activity. They were conscientious objectors during World War II who had been screened for psychological and physical health before participating. But starvation still changed them. Food began consuming their thoughts. Some collected recipes and cookbooks. Some talked exclusively about food and became increasingly preoccupied with meals. They also experienced emotional and social changes, including irritability, withdrawal, apathy, and difficulty concentrating. And that's important because our brains require an enormous amount of energy to function. When the body is deprived of what it needs while simultaneously experiencing prolonged stress, the way we think and the way we regulate ourselves, our focus of attention, and the way that we're able to evaluate decisions, that all can be affected. And when that deprivation becomes extreme enough, our world can start to narrow, and it can start narrowing around one central problem. I need to survive. That doesn't mean that starvation automatically makes someone violent, nor does it mean that you're going to go to the extreme as these women did. It also doesn't remove personal responsibility, but it does help us understand how circumstances can place such an enormous pressure on the way that we think. And sometimes understanding why someone did something doesn't excuse what they did. Psychologists who study scarcity sometimes describe something called tunneling, which is where you start to focus in on what you're lacking. So the resource that you're lacking starts consuming more and more of your attention. So if you're lacking money, that starts to become more difficult to not think about. If you're lacking time, everything starts to evolve around time. And in this case, if you're starving, food starts to become the most dominant thing in your world. Your attention starts to become more increasingly focused on solving the problem, and there's a lot less mental bandwidth for anything else. And I think this is where survival mode starts to become the most dangerous, because the more desperate we start becoming for relief, the easier it becomes to start evaluating everything else with this one question: will it make it stop? I think this famine situation makes such an interesting parallel later on in the Bible when we get to the part in Matthew where Jesus was fasting. So Matthew tells us that Jesus had fasted for 40 days and 40 nights, and he was hungry. I think at that point it's been like over a month, right? So you're starving. And I believe the same mental focus applies. All you start to think about in that fasted state is food. And that's when Matthew tells us that Satan tempts Jesus in the wilderness. But what was the first temptation? Food. The temptation targets the physical need Jesus is experiencing at that exact moment. But instead, he refuses to allow that immediate need to become God in his life. Or rather, he doesn't allow that immediate need to determine if he's going to obey God. Instead, he responds, "Man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes out of the mouth of God." So in other words, my need is real, but it doesn't need to become my God. And I think that's an important distinction when we talk about survival mode, because being desperate doesn't automatically mean that it's sinful or you're in some sort of sin. Being afraid doesn't automatically mean it's sinful, and being hungry doesn't mean that you're in sin. But desperation can make us vulnerable to believing that because a need is urgent, anything we do must satisfy that need. Therefore, it's justified. And that's where we have to be careful, because now we start to get into the cost of haste. And so this is kind of where the story begins to get even more tragic. So 2 Kings doesn't end with just the king tearing his clothes. Right after this, in 2 Kings 7, the prophet Elisha makes an unbelievable prophecy. He says, essentially, by this time tomorrow, you all will have food. Can you imagine how difficult that probably sounded, especially to these two mothers, or especially to the mother who actually sacrificed her son? People are paying enormous amounts of money. I mean, if people are even paying that, some people obviously just go hungry, but they're paying enormous amounts of money to get food. And Elisha comes along and says, "Oh, tomorrow you're going to have it." So she ate her son while help was approximately 1 day away. And she had no way of knowing that. I mean, she couldn't see the enemy camp. She couldn't hear what God was doing. She couldn't see that food was about to become available because she was still living in chapter 6, obviously, when help was in chapter 7. So all she could see was today. And that's the danger of desperation, because desperation makes today feel so permanent. When we are starving for relief, we start to make permanent decisions to solve temporary problems. That's because our minds have such difficulty imagining that our circumstances could ever become any different than what they are now. And scripture warns us about haste. It says in Proverbs 19:2, desire without knowledge is not good. How much more will hasty feet miss the way? And in Proverbs 21:5 says, the plans of the diligent lead to profit as surely as haste leads to poverty. So the tragedy of this story isn't necessarily that she made a terrible decision. It's that she made an irreversible decision during circumstances that were about to change. And this is where survival mode can become spiritually dangerous too, because survival mode says, I have to do something right now because nothing is going to change. I have to protect myself because nobody else will. I have to make this happen because I don't see a way out. But the thing is, faith has to leave room for something that survival mode naturally doesn't leave room for. And that is, God may be doing something that I cannot see. There's another mental shift that happens under severe stress, and that's becoming so focused on surviving the immediate moment that long-term consequences start to stop losing their meaning. Like this woman had a child who under normal circumstances probably would want to try to feed or protect, to watch grow up or to raise. But in this circumstance, she was also starving. And somehow her immediate need for survival ended up destroying her future. And that's the paradox of survival thinking. Sometimes the thing we do to survive today damages the life that we're hoping to have tomorrow. And while these examples that I'm about to share with you are nowhere near as extreme as hers, I think this is where we can begin to recognize the pattern that's within ourselves. So, for instance, you have someone who's financially desperate, right? But they make a decision that gives them immediate financial relief, but creates an even bigger problem 6 months down the road. Or you might have someone who is afraid of abandonment, so they start to become controlling or jealous, or they start to become increasingly suspicious of their partner because those patterns make them feel safer in the moment. And because of that, they eventually, slowly but surely, start destroying the relationship that they have. And someone who's terrified of rejection, they start to reject others first. So that way they don't become hurt when they or if they get rejected. Or you have someone who's emotionally overwhelmed. So they go back to an unhealthy coping mechanism because in the moment they're thinking about the temporary relief rather than next month, like what this is going to do for me in a month or in 2 months or a year. Essentially, all these examples are saying, I just need this to stop. Now, this is survival thinking on a much smaller scale, but that's why I don't think we should walk away from this story by simply thinking, oh, I would never do this to my child. I think the better question is, who do I or what am I willing to sacrifice when times become desperate enough? And then we have the second mother. And I think this is where the psychology gets even more complicated because these two women agree to the same plan. Your son first, then mine. And as horrific as this agreement is, there's still some kind of shared cost built into it. We're both starving and we're both going to lose something. However, the next day arrives and she is nowhere to be found. She's hidden. And there's a deep human response to that too, because it's easier to sacrifice something that's not yours. It's easier to believe that something is fair when you're not paying the price for it. But when the cost becomes personal, self-preservation often rewrites all the rules. So yesterday it was, we need to do this to survive. And now today is, nope, not mine. And that's where the phrase comes in for the story I've been thinking about a lot, which is my life before yours. Now, I'm not saying that that's what these mothers were thinking. Of course, the Bible doesn't tell us that, but I'm thinking about it as in when my needs in my life and your needs in your life start competing for each other. That's where morality starts to become extremely inconvenient. It's easy to say, I value honesty until it comes to my reputation. I value loyalty until being loyal costs me an opportunity. It's easy to say that I care about helping other people until helping someone else means that I end up having less. And it's easy to say that I trust God until obedience feels like it might threaten the security that I've built for myself. But this is also where survival thinking starts colliding with the Christian life, because the message of the Christian life is not my life before yours. In many ways, it's the complete opposite. Like we read in Philippians 2, it tells Christians not to act out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility to value others above themselves, looking not only to their interest, but to the interest of others. And then Paul gives us the ultimate example, which is Jesus. Jesus did not live according to my life before yours. In fact, he said, I'm going to die so that way you can experience your best life. Okay, so that doesn't mean that taking care of yourself is sinful. If you're hungry, you should eat. If you're in danger, get yourself out of danger. If you're struggling financially, you should be a good steward of what you've been given and take care of your responsibilities, of course. The problem becomes when preserving myself is so important that I'm willing to violate everything else I claim to value in order to do it. Because eventually, in survival mode and in great cases of desperation, we start to stop asking, what would God want me to do and what is right? Instead, we ask ourselves, what keeps me safe? So thankfully, most of us will not have to experience anything even remotely close than what these mothers had to experience. And I don't want to minimize their starvation by comparing it to like a bad week or, living paycheck to paycheck. The mental pattern underneath the behavior still needs to be examined because many of us still are in or are going to be in situations where we feel threatened. Maybe not physically, but maybe financially or spiritually, maybe relationally, emotionally, or even socially. And when you feel threatened, start examining what goes on in your mind. Do you feel less empathetic? Do you stop thinking about long-term consequences just for your immediate relief? Do you start justifying a behavior that you wouldn't in normal circumstances justify? Sometimes it looks like refusing to apologize because you don't want to admit the truth or admit that you were wrong. It looks like lying because you're terrified of the consequences of telling the truth. It looks like returning to the same unhealthy coping mechanism because the feeling that you feel right now needs to stop. So something to ask ourselves, have I convinced myself because I can't see another way out that God does not have one? Because this woman could not see chapter 7 from chapter 6, but we can. And we can see that while that city was starving, circumstances were already moving towards their favor. So hopefully none of us have to experience that exact same situation as those two mothers did. Their story shows us that prolonged stress, prolonged fear and deprivation and desperation can narrow the way that we think. And immediate survival starts to compete with everything that we value. And I think the most disturbing part of the story is not necessarily what she did, but how close to an answer that she was when she did it. Like she couldn't see that the enemy was fleeing and she couldn't see tomorrow. All she could see was today. And sometimes that's exactly what desperation does to us. It makes our problems feel permanent. But I want you to remember that your problems can feel real without them becoming your master. Your fear can be understandable without it becoming your decision maker. So understanding our mental patterns isn't about excusing destructive behavior, but it's about understanding what's happening to us early on. So that way fear and doubt and desperation and anything else tragic that we might think to do doesn't happen. And as Christians, that's part of what it means to allow God to transform us by changing the way we think. So if any of these things challenged you or challenged the way you think, or if you have anything else that you would like to add, please let me know in the comments. I would love to hear it. If you like this type of video, please hit the like button because that's how I know. And I do post this type of content every single week, so please subscribe. And until next week, keep allowing God to transform you by changing the way you think.